Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you send us and, well, we dive deep to pull out the key insights.
That's the idea.
So today, we're looking into the world the Apostle Paul stepped into when he was setting up the very first Christian churches. You shared some great stuff, a historical analysis, some really interesting quotes from theologians, historians.
Yeah, it's quite a mix.
And our goal, really, is to look past maybe the more romanticized views we sometimes have of the Graeco-Roman world. We want to get to grips with the actual moral, the social realities that Paul and his first followers were, dealing with day to day.
Exactly, because it's easy to get caught up in the philosophy or the big Roman monuments, right? But to really understand early Christianity's context, we need to dig into the everyday stuff, beliefs, social structures, the whole moral vibe of the place.
Okay, let's start unpacking that then. Because the material you sent throws us straight into this world that, well, it didn't really have a single standard of civilization, did it? It points out this big gap between the, quote, lofty teachings of philosophers, the stuff we often think of, and the very, very diverse, sometimes pretty jarring realities in those Roman and Greek cities.
Mm-hmm. And what's really striking is just the sheer range of cultures, of beliefs, all rubbing shoulders. Dr. Charles Bigg, who's quoted in the sources, he puts it quite vividly. He compares the difference between people back then to the difference between, his words, barbaric heathen and an Englishman.
Wow.
Yeah. He even draws a parallel to how complex India was under British rule. Just think about that for a second. That level of difference, all within the one empire. Different worldviews clashing, coexisting.
It does shift your perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You tend to think Roman Empire, solid block.
Yeah.
But underneath, it's this incredible patchwork. And the source argues that for Paul's first converts, the environment they were in was, in some ways, and I quote, even worse than places like India or China at the time, which is, that's quite a statement. It suggests the problems went beyond just cultural variety.
It is a bold claim, and it immediately makes you question any idea that, the times were somehow naturally leaning towards something better, spiritually or morally. The reality as we dig in seems much more complicated, and honestly, from our viewpoint today, often pretty problematic.
Okay, so here's where it gets really fascinating. Our sources acknowledge there were these lofty philosophies, these profound mysteries, the different cults offering secrets and salvation.
Right, the mystery religions and so on.
Yeah, and people like Dio Chrysostom mention simple religious people too. But the key point the source makes is that these weren't typical. They were the exceptions, like finding a Chang Chi Tung or a Tulsi Das or an Alfred the Great. They weren't representative of the average person's religious life.
Precisely. We can't just read Marcus Aurelius or Seneca and think, that's what everyone believed. Those writings, while important in some circles, didn't necessarily reflect the day-to-day religious practice of, the guy on the street in Corinth or Ephesus. There was often this huge gap between the fancy ideas in books and what people actually did.
And Ludwig Friedlander, mentioned in our material, adds another layer by looking at the difference between literature and archaeology, monuments, inscriptions, that sort of thing.
Yes, that's crucial.
His point is that the literature we often read comes from people who are maybe skeptical or maybe trying to reform popular beliefs. They weren't necessarily reflecting the mainstream.
That's such a vital distinction because while the intellectuals might be questioning the old gods, the monuments, which arguably give us a better peek into what more people believe, they overwhelmingly show this strong positive belief in, polytheism, lots of gods. So just reading the texts can give you a kind of skewed view.
Okay, so to really understand this world Paul was working in, the source boils it down to four kind of key elements that were just deeply woven into people's lives. You've got, one, this widespread belief in demons. Two, the moral character or lack thereof of religious rites. Three, the whole institution of slavery and the amphitheater games. And four, slavery again, but sort of as its own distinct massive force.
Right, let's tackle that first one, the belief in demons. The source doesn't mince words here. It suggests that when things got tough, heathenism turned naturally to devil worship, and it quotes the idea that the whole world lieth in the evil one. And this wasn't just some, fringe idea. It was everywhere.
Everywhere, like across all social classes.
Absolutely. Barbarians, Romans, Greeks, Jews, educated, uneducated, it didn't matter. This belief was almost universal. The source compares it to similar beliefs found in China or among certain tribal groups even much later, and the effects were real, often terrible. Sickness, both physical and mental, was often blamed on demons. It led to cruelty, fear, bondage, all sorts of vice.
It's kind of chilling. And even the intellectuals weren't immune.
That's what's so striking. Someone like Pliny the Elder, highly educated, maybe critical of the gods and the myths, he still totally accepted the reality of magic, of demonic forces. Think about that disconnect. Human sacrifice, witchcraft. These weren't just ancient myths. Plutarch, a respected writer, wrote seriously about rituals to appease evil spirits. Things involving, like, eating raw flesh, self-mutilation.
It paints a really grim picture.
It does, and it wasn't just abstract belief. There's physical evidence, right? Like lead tablets with curses scratched on them, bits of bone used in rituals. People relied heavily on omens, dreams, love potions. Even kids' tombstones sometimes mention these spiritual beings. This was the operative religion, as Dr. Big calls it, the religion people actually lived by day in, day out, shaped by fear.
And the source contrasts this with those maybe nicer-sounding versions of Eastern religions that some intellectuals were into.
Exactly. People like Sir Edwin Arnold or Annie Besant might have focused on the philosophical side, the mysticism, but that often skipped over the lived reality for many, both East and West, which involved this very direct, often scary engagement with the spirit world. Even looking closely at accounts of Buddhism in Ceylon or religion in China, you find similar underlying beliefs about spirits and demons.
So how did Paul approach here? Did he just say demons aren't real?
Well, that's the really interesting point the source makes. No, he didn't actually deny their existence. Instead, his message offered, quote, invincible weapons against them. He acknowledged the reality of these dark spiritual forces. You see it in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. So rather than trying to debunk something so deeply rooted, Paul met people where they were. He proclaimed Christ's absolute supremacy. Philippians 2.10, which is quoted, says, at Jesus' name, every knee should bow, including spiritual powers. Deliverance came through Christ's power over these forces, not by pretending they didn't exist. It's quite a savvy missionary approach, really.
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it, about how you approach deeply held beliefs even today. Maybe sometimes focusing on Christ's power over things is more effective than just trying to tear down the old beliefs directly.
Moving to the second element, the moral character of the religious rites. The source does acknowledge that some of the mystery religions, those secret initiation cults, they had potential for moral meaning. They touched on ideas like, soul versus body, God versus the world, the need for redemption.
Right, sort of more intellectual concepts. Knowledge, getting free from sin, returning to God, eternal life, even a kind of universal humanity idea.
Exactly. Adolf Harnack's work is mentioned here. But as Harnack himself pointed out, the number of people actually living by these higher ideas was pretty small. He called it a very narrow groove of real, vital religion. For most people, the popular stuff worshiping deities like Ceres, Isis, Cybele was very different.
Different how? Less moral.
Well, yes. The source describes these popular practices as often lacking deep truth and involving, frankly, questionable activities. Frenzied dancing, priests wandering around mutilating themselves. Temple rites are described as disgusting beyond all words, involving filthy objects of devotion and indecent accompanying worship.
Oof, that's strong language.
It is. The source says it's hard to even quote the legends of some gods, comparing them to problematic stories about Krishna, and suggests the worship was often as filthy as the god's supposed lives. Big temples, like in Ephesus or Corinth, weren't seen as homes of virtue. It compares them to temples in places like Benares or Peking at the time, definitely not centers of morality.
Wow. Okay, so that really puts Paul's letters into context. When he uses really strong language, say in Ephesians, about the way people were living.
He was likely just reflecting the reality his audience knew all too well. It makes you realize, too, that people doing missionary work today in really challenging moral environments, they might not be facing anything worse than what Paul saw.
Right. Okay, element 3. Slavery in the amphitheater. Two things, as the source says, that are mostly gone from our Western world now, thankfully. Let's talk about the amphitheater first. The attitude towards those games, it's just mind-boggling, even from the supposedly best men.
It's incredibly hard for us to grasp. The source highlights how little condemnation there was. Dr. Big apparently found only 3 passages in non-Christian writers expressing real moral horror. Friedlander notes there's scarcely one note of the horror of today in Roman literature about it.
So they just accepted it, or even liked it.
Worse, some justified it. Pliny, Cicero, they argued it trained people to endure pain, to despise death. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, seems mostly indifferent. And then you get that awful story about Symmachus being furious when Saxon prisoners killed themselves rather than fight in the arena for his son's games.
Yeah. And the story of Alypius really drives it home, how corrupting it was.
It does. He didn't want to go, right? Gets dragged there, shuts his eyes, but then the crowd roars, he looks, and boom. The source calls it a deadlier wound in his soul than any physical injury. He gets hooked on the bloodlust. It's a powerful example of how that kind of entertainment just ate away at people's morals.
Tertullian's quote sums it up. You can't watch without intense excitement, and that leads straight downhill morally.
And the effects were huge. First, it hammered home that brutal divide between people with rights and people without, reinforcing slavery. Second, it made everything else seem boring, leading to the theater becoming more and more degenerate just to compete.
And the regular theater sounds pretty bad, too. Vulgar, indecent, making fun of sacred things. The source gives that example of a fancy Pyrrhic dance in Corinth sounds elaborate. Mount Ida, gods, goddesses.
Yeah, but even that, while maybe more refined, wasn't necessarily conveying deep truths. And it was for the elite. For the masses, it was the mimes, often crude, raunchy performances. The overall effect was just vulgarity and spectacle.
It's just really hard to imagine the cumulative impact of seeing that stuff constantly.
Yeah.
You just don't have anything like gladiators or throwing people to beasts for fun today.
Not in the same way, no. Which brings us to that fourth element, slavery itself. Now, the source makes a point of distinguishing it from, say, American slavery. In Paul's time, slaves were often the same color, same race, sometimes even had the same education as their masters.
So if they were free, they could blend in more easily.
Potentially, yes. There wasn't that immediate visual marker or the deep-seated racial prejudice of later systems. It compares it to slavery in China, same race, but usually lower-class, uneducated slaves.
But the numbers in the Roman Empire were huge, right? Especially men in the cities.
Massive. A huge chunk of the urban population was either enslaved or recently freed. Corinth, for example, was apparently colonized by Caesar, using mainly freedmen. The source says the whole social structure of cities was penetrated through and through with this peculiar infection of slavery, servility, and shamelessness.
Even if some city slaves had it slightly better, maybe educated.
They still had zero rights, they were property. And the source really stresses the vulnerability, especially for women and boys, to their masters' whims. Sexual exploitation was just part of the system.
And people trying to hide whip scars. That's a chilling detail.
It is. And think about the impact on kids. Slave nurses raising them, maybe filling their heads with superstitions, slave tutors, pedagogues who might actually encourage bad behavior. Even the private schools run by freedmen, maybe academically decent, but still part of this whole system.
And the point about kids reading the myths, for us, they're just stories. For them, the temples to those gods with all their dodgy practices were right there. That must have been confusing, to say the least.
Absolutely. Plus, education and rhetoric actually train students to argue both sides of moral issues, which could, blur the lines pretty effectively.
So you've got young people growing up knowing the myths, fearing demons, seeing brutal games, surrounded by the effects of slavery. And Asia Minor was apparently even worse morally than Greece.
That's what the source suggests, yeah. Phrygian religion, for instance, apparently undermined basic social structures like marriage. It really does paint a picture of the enormous challenge Paul faced. How do you even start talking about virtue, reverence, decent behavior in that kind of environment?
It raises that interesting question about the early church and slavery.
Yeah.
Professor Harnack is quoted saying, basically, don't expect them to be abolitionists. It's an anachronism.
Right. Christians mostly saw slavery like they saw the government just part of the way the world was.
And the churches had both slaves and owners in them.
Yes. The focus was on how they should treat each other within that system. Masters, be kind. Slaves, be faithful. The very fact that there wasn't a big slave question debate early on just shows how totally accepted it was.
And the source argues that because there weren't those later racial barriers, the master-slave dynamic might have been even more intense in a way.
It's a complex point. But the overall conclusion is clear. Despite any philosophy or education floating around, the reality of slavery, the games, the temples, the magic. It means Paul's converts weren't coming from some morally superior place compared to converts today. If anything, it was arguably much tougher.
So, bringing this deep dive together, the moral and social world Paul entered was, well, incredibly challenging. Saturated with superstition, real fear of demons, religious practices often morally compromised, brutal entertainment, and this massive, pervasive institution of slavery shaping everything.
Yeah, it's a far cry from any sort of golden age myth, isn't it? Understanding these realities, I think, gives you a much deeper appreciation for what Paul was actually doing and just how radical and transformative his message must have sounded in that context.
Absolutely. And that leads to something for you, the listener, to think about. How does digging into the specific, often uncomfortable details of a historical context change how we see things? How does it reshape our understanding of events, of people like Paul and their impact? What assumptions do we maybe carry about the past, about its morality or civility, that perhaps need a closer look when we do these deeper dives? It's a good reminder that history is rarely simple and almost never black and white.